My name is Hannah, and I am a 31-year-old cybersecurity specialist. For a very long time, I lived in a highly cramped and incredibly noisy studio apartment. The single window rattled every time a heavy truck drove by, and the kitchen sink had a constant drip that I could never fix. I simply accepted this uncomfortable life because I was carrying a massive burden of monthly student loan payments that completely drained almost my entire paycheck. I ate incredibly cheap meals and meticulously tracked every single penny on a digital spreadsheet just to survive. But the most tragic part of my difficult financial struggle was the specific reason I had those heavy federal loans in the very first place. When I was 18 years old, right before I was supposed to leave for my freshman year of college, my mother Martha sat me down at our kitchen table. She deliberately put on a soft and deeply sorrowful voice to deliver what she claimed was devastating family news. She looked me directly in the eyes and sadly claimed that my entire college savings fund had been completely wiped out by a sudden stock market crash. I cried terribly that night, and the very next morning she calmly helped me fill out massive student loan paperwork as if it was my only option to secure a future. Because of this alleged financial tragedy, I started my adult life deeply in debt and constantly stressed. Meanwhile, my older sister Chloe experienced a completely different reality. Chloe miraculously managed to purchase a massive 4-bedroom luxury home at the incredibly young age of 27. My mother Martha constantly praised Chloe to anyone who would listen openly, calling her a financial genius who knew exactly how to save money. At the exact same time, my mother actively used me as the ultimate family cautionary tale. At every single holiday gathering or weekend family dinner, Martha would stand in the middle of the room and loudly broadcast to our extended relatives that I was severely struggling. She would deliberately tell aunts and cousins that I was still renting a tiny, depressing place and that my career in the tech industry was highly unpredictable and unstable. She deliberately crafted a completely false public narrative, heavily implying that I was incredibly jealous of the beautiful home and perfect life of my sister. Whenever Chloe showed off her expensive home renovations, my mother would look at me with entirely fake pity. By spreading these calculated lies, Martha effectively turned her own daughter into a pathetic charity case, simply to elevate and glorify her favored golden child. I spent years completely believing I was just financially unlucky, having absolutely no idea that my own mother had orchestrated my entire struggle. For over a decade, I completely believed the tragic financial story my mother had meticulously sold to our family. I simply accepted my difficult reality and continued to work exhausting hours at my demanding cybersecurity job just to keep my head above water. But my entire universe violently shifted on a very quiet Tuesday night in November. I was sitting alone on the cold, hard floor of my tiny studio apartment, staring at my laptop and debugging a complex server issue when my cell phone suddenly buzzed. I looked down at the bright screen and was incredibly surprised to see the name of my Uncle Arthur. He was a very quiet man who rarely reached out to me outside of sending standard generic birthday messages. When I answered the phone, his voice sounded highly anxious and incredibly heavy, as if he had been nervously pacing around his living room for several hours trying to find the ultimate courage to speak. Uncle Arthur took a deep, trembling breath and finally revealed a dark family secret he had been painfully carrying for over 10 years. He explicitly informed me that my college savings fund was absolutely never lost in any sudden stock market crash. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest as he slowly explained the terrifying hidden truth. He told me that during the exact month I turned 18, right before I was supposed to leave for my university, my mother Martha walked directly into the local bank. She did not go there to check on the balance or secure my future. She went there to personally withdraw the entire account. Uncle Arthur had personally witnessed the transaction and watched her aggressively empty the entire balance of exactly $42,380. Because he deeply knew what she was doing was fundamentally wrong, he secretly kept copies of the official bank statements to preserve the undeniable physical proof. But the most devastating part of this horrifying revelation was the chilling timeline he laid out for me next. Uncle Arthur explained that the massive sum of money was immediately transferred into a private joint account strictly controlled by my mother. Exactly 2 weeks after Martha aggressively emptied my entire educational fund, my older sister Chloe miraculously closed on the massive down payment for her beautiful luxury home. I slowly slid my laptop aside and lay completely flat on the floor of my tiny apartment. The dripping kitchen faucet echoed loudly in the silent room as a terrifying clarity washed over my entire body. I finally realized that my sister did not possess any incredible financial genius. Her perfect, heavily praised life and her beautiful luxury home were quite literally built using my stolen future. My own mother had intentionally sacrificed my education and violently trapped me in a decade of crushing financial debt just to purchase a perfect reality for her favorite golden child. After uncovering that horrifying truth, my very first physical instinct was to immediately pick up my cell phone and call my mother. I desperately wanted to furiously demand answers and scream at her for deliberately ruining my financial future. But as my trembling thumb hovered over her contact name, I quickly realized that a direct verbal confrontation would be a massive strategic mistake. I knew exactly how Martha operated because I had watched her expertly manipulate our extended family for my entire life. If she was directly challenged, my mother would instantly play the deeply wounded victim and aggressively deny the massive theft. She would immediately twist the narrative to make me look completely unhinged and highly unstable. Within a matter of hours, she would eagerly call every single aunt and cousin to falsely claim that I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown out of pure, bitter jealousy. I deeply realized that confrontation simply gives a professional liar a massive public stage to perform on. Instead of giving her that sick satisfaction, I made a brilliant and highly calculated decision to use absolute silence as my ultimate weapon. That very same night, I opened my laptop in the dark and created a strict financial spreadsheet that meticulously tracked every single dollar to the exact penny. I completely threw myself into my demanding cybersecurity career with a relentless and cold new focus. I began willingly working exhausting 12 to 14-hour days just to dramatically accelerate my savings. I survived entirely on cheap meal-prepped chicken and strong black coffee while I quietly automated a massive portion of my monthly paycheck directly into aggressive index funds and investment accounts. I forced myself to live far below my means and pretended that extra growing money did not even exist. At my tech firm, I operated under the powerful mentorship of my tough but incredibly fair boss, Evelyn, who truly recognized my relentless drive and raw talent. Evelyn trusted me enough to hand me a highly complex proposal for a massive corporate hospital account that had a notoriously tight deadline. I spent countless months debugging servers late into the night, entirely focused on winning that specific lucrative contract. When I successfully secured that massive hospital account, it officially proved my undeniable worth to the executive board, and my professional salary completely skyrocketed overnight. Despite achieving this massive professional milestone, I completely stopped sharing any career updates or personal victories with my toxic family. Whenever my mother occasionally called to loudly brag about the new expensive renovations Chloe was doing, I simply smiled through the phone and gave incredibly boring, generic answers. I willingly allowed them to continue believing I was exactly the pathetic, struggling failure they always described to the relatives. I was no longer a terrified victim but a highly calculating silent architect quietly building a powerful new life entirely in the shadows, where their toxic financial control could never reach me again. Over the next few years, my strategic silence and relentless work ethic paid off in unimaginable ways. My tough but fair boss Evelyn officially promoted me to a senior management position. That incredible promotion pushed my annual salary to over $145,000 a year. At the exact same time, the secret index funds I had been aggressively feeding practically doubled in value. Armed with this massive financial security, I finally had the power to change my physical reality. I began quietly touring luxury real estate on Saturday mornings, completely alone. I was not just looking for a building to live in, but I was actively searching for a profound feeling of ultimate freedom. After several weeks of searching, I eventually found a breathtaking architectural masterpiece located high in the West Hills. The listing price was $950,000. The property featured gorgeous floor-to-ceiling glass windows that flooded the space with natural light and beautiful original hardwood floors. The best part was a massive wraparound wooden deck that completely overlooked a lush green valley of swaying trees. It was the exact opposite of my cramped and noisy studio apartment. I ran the financial numbers multiple times and confidently purchased the massive estate entirely on my own. When I finally received the physical deed and the heavy front door keys, I did not call my mother. I did not send a text message to my sister Chloe to brag about my massive purchase. Instead, I quietly moved my very few personal belongings into the gorgeous and echoing space without telling a single member of my toxic family. I brought my simple clothes, my laptop, and a few kitchen items into $1 million home. The house was enormous and entirely empty, but it felt incredibly warm. I spent my first weekend just sitting on the living room floor, enjoying the ultimate peace of a private sanctuary I had built completely from scratch. I physically held the ultimate proof of my success in my hands, but I was not ready to reveal it just yet. I knew that simply telling my mother about the house over the phone would give her the opportunity to twist the narrative or aggressively downplay my massive achievement. So I patiently placed the official property deed inside my desk drawer and consciously decided to wait. I was waiting for the absolute perfect moment to finally introduce my toxic family to the undeniable reality of my quiet success. I spent the first few months of the year quietly enjoying my massive new estate and patiently waiting. I knew my mother could never resist an audience, and I knew the perfect opportunity to finally expose her would eventually present itself. That exact moment for ultimate justice finally arrived during a massive Easter dinner hosted at the heavily remodeled house of my sister Chloe. There were roughly 25 extended relatives crammed into her living room, and the entire house smelled like expensive new paint. My mother, Martha, was in absolute heaven, acting like a professional tour guide, pointing out every single expensive detail Chloe had recently purchased. After the massive meal was finished, everyone naturally drifted into the main living room. Martha decided it was the perfect time to perform her usual toxic routine. She confidently stood up in the center of the room, raised her glass of wine, and delivered a glowing toast. She loudly praised the incredible financial success of Chloe, talking about how brilliant her investments were and how beautiful her luxury home had become. The entire room politely clapped, but then my mother deliberately shifted her focus. Dripping with completely fake sympathy, Martha publicly turned to me. In front of 24 relatives, she loudly pitied me for supposedly still renting a tiny, noisy apartment. She looked at me with a tragic expression and loudly offered to help me find affordable low-income housing, claiming she knew a cheap landlord who could rescue me from my unpredictable struggles. Chloe eagerly chimed in to support the toxic narrative. She leaned over from her expensive couch and arrogantly asked me if I was simply jealous. She wanted me to publicly admit that I was bitterly jealous of her perfect fixed-rate mortgage and her brand-new $30,000 kitchen. The entire room went completely silent, waiting for my reaction. I did not scream, and I absolutely did not cry. I refused to give them the dramatic emotional breakdown they so desperately wanted. Instead, I simply maintained absolute chilling eye contact with my sister for several heavy seconds. I calmly stood up, walked into the hallway, and began putting on my jacket to leave. As I held my car keys in my hand, I casually turned back to face the crowded room. I looked directly at my sister and smoothly invited Chloe over for afternoon tea that upcoming Saturday. I kept my voice entirely light and explicitly mentioned that I had recently moved into a new place and would love to finally host her. The entire room shifted in sudden, profound confusion. My mother immediately frowned and demanded to know what cheap new apartment I was renting, but I did not explain anything. I simply told Chloe I would text her the new address and walked right out the front door, leaving them completely trapped in their own confusion. When Saturday afternoon finally arrived, I spent the entire morning quietly preparing my stunning sunlit luxury home. I did not hire any expensive catering because I wanted the environment to feel completely authentic and undeniably mine. I stood in my massive kitchen and baked fresh lemon and blueberry scones, using a simple recipe I had found years ago during my darkest financial struggles. By early afternoon, my beautiful $1 million architectural masterpiece smelled incredibly warm like sugar and fresh citrus. I carefully arranged 2 ceramic mugs on the solid maple table and simply sat by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows waiting for my sister to arrive. I was not nervous at all because my hands were perfectly still and my mind was incredibly clear. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard the distinct sound of heavy tires slowly crunching up my long, private gravel driveway. I looked out the window and saw the expensive SUV belonging to Chloe come to a complete stop. Chloe had fully expected to arrive at another cramped and deeply depressing apartment located in a terrible neighborhood. Instead, she found herself sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat, completely paralyzed and staring through her windshield at a massive estate. She eventually turned off the engine and slowly walked up my stone path, her expensive heels clicking loudly in the quiet afternoon air. When I opened the heavy wooden door and warmly welcomed her inside, Chloe was visibly trembling. She slowly walked through the massive vaulted entryway, completely paralyzed by the gorgeous stone fireplace, and the sweeping valley views spreading out below my wraparound deck. She turned in a slow circle with her hand covering her mouth as her brain desperately tried to process the impossible reality standing right in front of her. Stuttering and deeply disoriented, Chloe finally asked how I could possibly afford to rent such an incredible mansion. I looked her directly in the eyes and calmly clarified that I was not renting anything at all. I explicitly told her that I actually owned the massive estate outright, fully paid for through my highly lucrative salary as a senior director. Hearing those specific words caused the entire fabricated reality of my sister to violently shatter into pieces. Her face did not show anger but rather a state of pure panic and raw, disorienting confusion. The fake narrative our mother had fed her for over a decade was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. In a state of absolute desperation, Chloe immediately pulled out her cell phone. Her fingers were shaking so violently that she could barely manage to press the buttons to make the call. She desperately called our mother Martha, and her voice violently cracked as she demanded that Martha rush over to the exact address immediately to witness the impossible. I simply smiled and offered her a warm cup of tea while we waited for the ultimate trap to close. My sister Chloe sat frozen at the massive kitchen table while we waited for our mother to arrive. The silence in my beautiful million-dollar home was incredibly heavy. Exactly 19 minutes after that panicked phone call, I heard a car engine violently roaring up my long, private gravel driveway. My mother Martha had driven across town at breakneck speed, clearly expecting to find a massive medical emergency or a terrible tragedy. I heard her expensive heels quickly clicking on the stone path outside. She aggressively pushed open the heavy front door, breathing heavily and fully prepared to take absolute control of whatever chaotic situation was happening. But when she stepped through the grand vaulted entryway, her entire body immediately froze. She looked up at the towering ceiling and the gorgeous stone fireplace and the sweeping valley views visible through the massive glass windows. She was standing inside the undeniable and overwhelming wealth of the exact same daughter she had publicly labeled a pathetic failure for over a decade. The physical shock was so profound that her face instantly turned the color of pale paper. She slowly walked into the living room, completely unable to comprehend the massive architectural masterpiece surrounding her. I could visibly see her highly manipulative brain working desperately, trying to figure out a way to spin a brand new lie to regain her lost power. But before Martha could even attempt to open her mouth and change the narrative, the heavy front door opened again. My Uncle Arthur quietly walked inside. He stepped right past my completely paralyzed mother and walked directly into the highly tense living room. Without saying a single word to anyone, he calmly reached into his jacket and quietly placed a plain white envelope on the solid maple kitchen table right next to my freshly baked scones. I calmly reached out and picked up the envelope while my mother and sister watched me with terrified eyes. I slowly broke the seal and pulled out the official credit union bank statement. I looked directly at my mother and began to read the undeniable ink on paper aloud to the completely silent room. I explicitly detailed the specific custodial account that was originally opened strictly for my college education. I read the exact dates and pointed directly to the massive withdrawal of exactly $42,380 made during the exact same month I turned 18. I then placed the paper flat on the wooden table and pointed directly to the undeniable handwritten signature of Martha, perfectly centered at the bottom of the official page. I kept my voice entirely steady as I read the final devastating line, proving that the massive funds were directly transferred to her private joint account. I looked at my trembling sister and explicitly stated that this exact financial transfer happened precisely 2 weeks before her heavily praised down payment miraculously cleared the bank. The undeniable paper evidence was finally completely exposed in the bright sunlight of my beautiful home, and the ultimate trap had flawlessly snapped shut. As the undeniable paper evidence sat completely flat on my beautiful maple kitchen table, the deafening silence in the room finally broke, and our entire family dynamic violently exploded. My sister Chloe slowly stood up from her chair and walked over to the table like she was approaching a ghost. She picked up the official credit union statement with violently shaking hands. Her eyes desperately tracked the printed numbers and the undeniable dates. The horrifying realization physically washed over her body as she finally understood that the massive amount of money she used to buy her beautiful luxury home was actually stolen directly from my educational future. Chloe tearfully turned to our mother and confronted her with a deeply cracking voice. She explicitly revealed to the room that Martha had always strictly claimed that the massive down payment was simply a generous gift, coming entirely from the personal life savings of our parents. Chloe was absolutely horrified to fully realize her perfect, highly praised life was built entirely on a massive, toxic lie. My father, Thomas, who had also rushed over in the panic, was sitting heavily in a chair against the wall, looking utterly devastated by the unfolding scene. Hearing Chloe speak, he finally lifted his head and openly realized the terrifying depth of the betrayal. He looked directly at my mother and softly stated that she had deliberately shown him a completely forged and heavily manufactured document many years ago. Martha had maliciously created a fake financial summary to falsely prove the college fund was entirely lost in the market crash, strictly to hide her massive financial theft from her own husband. Her completely perfect public mask was finally crumbling into absolute dust right in front of her favorite captive audience. Desperate to immediately regain her lost control and stop the bleeding, Martha aggressively tried to pull rank. Her face rapidly shifted from pale white to a furious burning red as she loudly demanded absolute respect. She actively tried to use the commanding, authoritative voice she always used at family holiday dinners, aggressively claiming she was the devoted matriarch who made the hard financial choices to hold our family together. She loudly yelled that she had raised me, fed me, and sacrificed everything for me. But I absolutely did not let her finish her toxic theatrical performance. I firmly held up my right hand right in the middle of her desperate sentence and completely stopped her frantic talking. I kept my voice incredibly steady and calmly, stated that while she was indeed my mother, she was also a massive thief and a highly manipulative liar. Without screaming, crying, or throwing a single insult, I established my ultimate power in the room, calmly demanding that her toxic lies and her completely fabricated public narratives must immediately stop. As I stood in my beautiful living room, looking at the shattered expressions of my family, I kept my voice entirely calm. I looked directly at my mother and explicitly stated that I absolutely did not want the stolen $42,000 back. I told her I did not need a single penny of her money because I had successfully built my incredible life completely without her help. I only demanded the absolute truth and the permanent end to her fabricated public narratives. The social consequences for Martha were incredibly swift and totally devastating. She desperately tried to call her siblings to spin a brand new story, but the undeniable paper evidence was already out there. By Monday morning, the shocking truth about the official credit union bank statement had rapidly spread through the entire extended family like a massive wildfire. The exact same aunts and cousins Martha had proudly used to spread vicious rumors about my financial struggles instantly turned their backs on her. The social fallout was absolute and completely merciless. Martha was entirely removed from the massive family group chats she used to constantly dominate. She was explicitly excluded from the upcoming summer holiday cookouts and completely stripped of her highly cherished social narrative. For her entire adult life, she had maintained her ultimate power by tightly controlling the family story, but now she was left completely isolated. A few days after the massive confrontation at my estate, my cell phone buzzed. It was my sister Chloe. When I answered the phone, she was heavily in tears, offering a profound and genuinely desperate apology. She was no longer the arrogant golden child showing off her expensive kitchen, but a deeply broken woman finally seeing her reality clearly. Chloe completely broke down and confessed that the suffocating toxic control Martha held over her life had almost entirely destroyed her marriage to her husband David. Chloe tearfully admitted that David was heavily prepared to walk away from their relationship because she was constantly allowing our mother to dictate every single detail of their private lives, from their expensive home renovations to the strict way they managed their personal finances. Chloe finally realized with absolute horror that she had spent her entire adult life simply performing on a stage for a deeply manipulative mother. She wanted to prove she was the successful daughter so badly that she never realized she was essentially a prisoner. To save her own marriage and finally protect her own family, Chloe officially chose to step completely away from the toxic shadow of our mother. She established her own ironclad boundaries, leaving Martha completely isolated and entirely alone in her empty house, with the heavy consequences of her decade-long deception. In the quiet and peaceful aftermath of that massive family explosion, I invited my Uncle Arthur over for dinner at my estate. As we sat on my beautiful wooden deck watching the sun set over the green valley, he finally revealed one last beautiful truth to me. He softly explained that the stolen college fund was not actually started by my parents at all. It was actually started by my late grandmother the year I was born. She had secretly saved $50 every single month directly from her fixed Social Security checks, strictly for my future education. Uncle Arthur explained that she deeply knew I was different from my sister and she knew I would eventually need financial protection from my highly manipulative mother. Hearing that incredible revelation brought me to completely uncontrollable tears. For my entire adult life, I felt entirely abandoned by my family, but I finally realized I was truly loved all along by someone who was quietly watching over me from the very beginning. Several months later, a highly hesitant handwritten letter arrived in my mail. I immediately recognized the neat cursive handwriting of my mother Martha. It was absolutely not a grand, sweeping apology or a desperate plea for forgiveness. Instead, it was a very small and deeply defeated crack in her massive ego, simply stating she was trying to understand the terrible choices she had made. I did not call her to argue, and I did not write back. I simply folded the paper and filed it away in my heavy desk drawer right next to my $1 million property deed and that undeniable credit union bank statement. I was finally at absolute complete peace. Looking back at my long, exhausting journey from that deeply depressing, noisy studio apartment to this breathtaking architectural masterpiece, I realized something incredibly profound. Setting firm, ironclad boundaries with toxic people is absolutely never a cruel betrayal, but rather a highly necessary act of human survival. I completely stopped waiting for my toxic family to give me their permission to be incredibly proud of myself. I did not need their fake applause or their stolen money, because I successfully built my entire beautiful reality completely from scratch, using absolute silence as my ultimate strategy. If you are currently sitting in a dark room feeling entirely trapped by a deeply manipulative parent, I want you to know that your future belongs entirely to you. You are allowed to quietly build a beautiful life they can never touch. If you have ever had to set ironclad boundaries to survive a toxic family member, please hit that like button right now and actively share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it today. Please subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of ultimate survival and justice, and let me know your own story in the comments below.